So really what I've learned is that one, my story's going to change as I edit it. Two, I think that I've really learned to think about this bigger than just the story, but think about it as a world. Third is this. The third big learning is that I'm realizing I have way more stories to share than I thought. As I've gone through and edited my book, I realized that it has really been changing and morphing over time. And in the beginning, it gave me a lot to think about and almost kind of sent my brain into a spiral, not knowing or not being sure which path to take for my book as it was forming. Like, which road did I want to go down to fully form this novel? So today I want to share about how my book has changed, how I even made the decision to choose which path to change it on, what I've learned from it, and how I feel about it. Hey, I'm Kayla. I used to say that I am a new author writing my memoir turn young adult dystopian fantasy, but now, as I've been editing my book, that has changed. And as I've been making these vlogs, even over the last few weeks, I'm like, how do I introduce myself anymore? I think that it would go something like this. Hi, I'm Kayla. I'm a debut author writing a young adult fantasy inspired by my experience in growing up in poverty. Because as I've been going, my book has changed over time. And the first things first is that I don't really think that anymore I'm writing my memoir. When I very first started on this book adventure, I was telling everybody who asked me about it, I was like, really think that it's like Percy Jackson meets the Hunger Games. And the reason being was this. What I loved about the beginning of Percy Jackson is that it was very on the nose, exactly how like a kid lives. Like, it talked about school in a place that was relatable. Like, anybody who lived in New York, anybody who lived in America could like really, really relate to the real things Percy Jackson was saying. He talked about having ADHD and his teachers and moving schools. And it wasn't fantasy world. It was real life with real roads that look like how we live in America. And then he moved into like this magical world of Greek mythology and things like that, where there was magic, where there were, all the characters from Greek mythology that we know, they were living there in that world and he was discovering them. So it was like real life, regular kid meets magical world. And I guess in a way, Harry Potter does that too. Then that was like that fantasy element that I wanted to create, but I wanted to create it with like that real life piece first, because my idea and thought was that kids like me would feel seen. What I love about Percy Jackson is that kids who have ADHD or my cat's going crazy, or struggled in school would feel really seen by him and then have this adventure that they go on. Why I said that it was kind of like the Hunger Games is because there's a transition in worlds there too. Of course, Katniss starts in her world, and this is where I got the idea of dystopian, right? That idea of Percy Jackson was more fantasy, but the Hunger Games is more of a dystopian novel where the world that she lives in is it's not unlike the real world. Like, we can see how it relates. They still live in houses and things like that, but the government of it is the dystopian piece. And then she moves into another world. She goes to the capital. She goes into the games, right? That's kind of like her moving into another world. And so how I kind of saw it was like if Katniss Everdeen, living in her dystopian world, moved into a fantasy world like Percy Jackson does, or it moves into a fantasy world like Percy Jackson does. But that has started to change as I've been evolving in this editing. And how I wanted this to really look when I'm saying that it was my memoir is that's how I felt I moved. Like growing up, I grew up in a town. The neighborhood that I grew up in, that town, was impoverished. It was like crazy things happen on my street, like people, just like normal everyday poverty things of like being evicted, cars repossessed, things like that. But there's also like a murder on the other block and different things like that. So I wanted to share those real things that happened to me and then create and add it through magic, because that's something I loved. And I loved reading books and I loved reading fantasy growing up. And I felt like that really helped me move forward. But it's all evolved. And I think some of the things that I've found, and the more that I've been writing, the more that I've been editing to create a great story, the more I've been saying I'm taking artistic liberties, which I don't know why I put that in air quotes, because it is just true. But the more artistic liberties I've taken have moved this to be further and further away from being a solid memoir, right? So like the first thing I did is I was like, oh, well, I'm moving timelines. Like really, I'm condensing a bunch of activities that for me happened over 3 years into a 1 year kind of timeline, is how it feels, like this one book, right? It's really not spread out that far. And then I was like jumping events, like, oh, this event happened technically first in my life, but I'm putting it later because that sounds, cooler. And so there were small things like that, but it was still a lot of events. But as I've gone through, the story has evolved where I've really changed characters and their purposes in my life and given them more meaning, more depth, and wanting their story to like continue. If you've looked at and watched my editing playlist, specifically where I talk about my setting and then specifically where I talk about my deep dive into my characters, you can hear how much of that is changing. And these people are becoming less the real people in my lives, but more people that can build, or more characters that will build a story that builds a world that we want to get lost in. And so here is why I decided to even do that to begin with. In the 2 weeks or so, or 2 to 4 weeks that I took off between finishing the first draft and before I started editing, I was really thinking about, what do I want this to be like? Like, I've been so excited thinking about my future of getting a book deal and getting this published and you reading this book and people all around the world reading this book. And so I would journal, like, what does that look like? What does this feel like? And one of the things that I wrote about, and I'm going to take you down my thought process for this. And I realize that this thought process can get backed by evidence in any way, but this is the way my brain did it and what I wanted it to evolve into. But my thought process when I wrote this is I just keep imagining myself. I can feel the pressure behind my eyes in a good way of just like the emotion that this brings to me, I just got goosebumps. Like, can you see those? Anyways, the emotion that this brings to me for the potential of this story, because when I think about myself as a kid lining up in line to go to a midnight pickup of the book for one of the Harry Potter books, when I think about the conversations that I used to have all the way from like when I was in elementary school, being obsessed with my friend Carrie Thayer about the Harry Potter series and talking about it and how do you pronounce Hermione and what do you think is going to happen next, and just waiting for the next book to come out and then reading them side by side next to each other, all the way to like high school when I was working at American Eagle and we were in the back talking about Horcruxes and like what could it be? All of the things that I currently have on my bookshelves, all of the art that is currently Harry Potter inspired on my wall. Me as an adult, how I love to dress up, how some of my best days of my lives were going and most enjoyable and most emotional. And obviously there's other days like weddings and stuff, but days I've thoroughly enjoyed in my life of going to the Wizarding World in Orlando, or when I got to go to the actual museum from the movie sets in London. Like those are the things that I'm writing about the future of my book. And I'm going to be honest, I think a huge part of that is the magical elements, the difference from our world. I don't think there are people building amusement parks and selling merch like that and building worlds that other people can step into when I'm writing a book about the world that we're currently in. If I'm writing a book about my town that I grew up in, it's like, that's not something that people can step into that's new and different. That's what was so exciting. Like Harry Potter, if we just stayed on Privet Drive the whole time, the book was about him on Privet Drive the whole time, it would not have hit the same. And we all know it. So that was my thought process of like, okay, if this is what I want for this book series to be this phenomena that we can all get excited and that we can just go somewhere different in our mind, then I got to take my readers somewhere different in their minds. So that is what led me to say, okay, this is less my memoir and this is more inspired by my memoir. And I'm even going to change what I said about my intro just now when we very first started this, is that I don't think I'm going to take away the dystopian piece, because now it's more like this. It's less Percy Jackson. It's less Katniss Everdeen and Percy Jackson. It's more Katniss Everdeen and Harry Potter, where she's coming in this dystopian world that she lives in now, and she's transitioning to a world of magic. Like, that's actually fairly accurate to say about what's happening. So there's no more like on the nose necessarily real life, but there's this dystopian world that she transfers out of into the magical world. And ooh, I just got so excited thinking about it. I can't wait to write like the second and third book when she's in that magical world, because that's kind of like Katniss's thing too, right? The second and third book is when she's really working on taking down the system and taking down the Capitol and like thinking about that. And that's the same for my character, where her goal is to get rid of the withering, which is what I've kind of like embodied poverty as. And so it's like, how does she take that down? How does she take down the system so that that is not something that is encroaching or being in people's lives anymore? And so that part of like Katniss Everdeen, like the way that she moves through the Hunger Games and stuff, is really pivotal in that it's like this us versus the system type of story. It's a very like classism type of story. And so I'm really, really excited about that. But there's that magical element of Harry Potter. So when I think about this book and how it's growing or changing, it's really been about giving myself that permission to follow the vision fully, not just the vision of like, because I can envision any story. I can envision this being so real life teen in a high school living in poverty, right? I can envision this being just like Percy Jackson. I can envision it any which way, but it's not just the plot. It is, what do I want this book to become the world? And when I started envisioning that on the wider scale, how do I want you to interact with the story? How do I want other people to interact with the story? How do I want it to feel like? That morphed and changed, or that became more clear to me, and that has changed the direction that I have chosen to write this book. So really what I've learned is that, one, my story is going to change as I edit it. I just didn't put any thought into it, but I feel like that's pretty obvious. But now I know as a writer. Two, I think that I've really learned to think about this bigger than just the story, but think about it as a world. The world is also the part outside of my book. What do I want that life to be like for everybody else interacting? Thinking more about the people who are going to be reading my book. And that, I think, has given me so much clarity about my story. So that's the second big learning that I had. But the third is this. The third big learning is that I'm realizing I have way more stories to share than I thought. When I thought about first writing this book, it was that I wanted to share my experience. And I know, and if you've been around, you've heard me describe this, where it's like, I want to have this young adult series, but there would also be, after I write this, it'll also basically be a whole series starting at picture books for 5-year-olds going and all the way up to this young adult series. And so I will go and like backfill that this is the most complex, much more complex to this than to write a picture book. So I wanted to get all of this done first, and then I will create that coming up to it. But beyond this, there are so many other stories. Like I think about reading The Genius of Judy about Judy Blume, and how she would get inspired by something and write like a short novel. And I realized there are so many short novels in me that I would put out about a teenage girl living in poverty. There's a short novel that I would put out about a woman my age, grown-ass adult, that realizes she had a traumatic upbringing and how she lives with it and how she deals with it, because I think those things would be so powerful for people too. And I don't have to put all of that in this one book, but there are so many stories that I have. And when I think about that, why do I keep getting goosebumps? It just feels so powerful to think about that, because I think about that's not just for me, is the thought that gave me those goosebumps, is that I believe that's probably the case for you too. I believe that you probably have so many stories to share, also, more than you even think, more that is in you and is in your life experience and is in your brain and is in your knowledge and your skill that you can share with the world. And like, what a beautiful, wonderful place we are that we get to take action on those, that we get to move forward with those, that we get to decide the path that we want to go down and start following it, knowing it's going to morph, right? Seeing it as a big world and experience that we can give to other people, and then just continuing to do that with our stories over time, over and over again. Like, wow, I can't believe this is my life right now. And now, like, embarking on my career at the beginning of a whole new chapter. So good.